everyone, and welcome to our panel for International Women's Week, Our Mother's Daughters. This event is a collaboration between Archipel Research and Consulting and Rubiks Counseling Services. Today, we have a group of panelists of BIPOC women who will be talking about the role of the women in their lives and where they've gotten to today. Often when we talk about BIPOC communities, we're discussing some of the systemic barriers or intergenerational trauma or other really important topics. But what we often don't discuss is that these challenges and histories came with stories of resilience, strengths, and knowledge that were passed on, particularly through the women in our lives. I can't think of a better group considering that these are all members of two women-led organizations that have been working hard to provide different spaces and education within our local and national communities. Before I go to the panel and get the panelists to introduce themselves, I'm going to start by introducing myself. I will be your moderator for today. My name is Walat Farhat, and I'm a psychotherapist and co-founder of Rubiks Counseling Services. Samia and I founded Rubiks after we realized that there was a huge gap in the services provided with mental health and social services, both in Ottawa and nationally. Whether it was the lack of accessibility, the lack of cultural responsive services, or understanding within different organizations, and places where, or spaces where BIPOC communities felt like they could be themselves. And this is how we ended up where we are today. Before I jump into the panel, I want to start with a land acknowledgement. We want to begin by recognizing that all of us here today are on the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Algonquin Nation. The Algonquin Nation never signed a treaty or gave their consent for Ottawa to be established here. They continue to be stewards of the land, which includes the entire watershed of Kichisibi, known as the Ottawa River in English, an area the size of Great Britain that includes parts of the lands claimed by both Ontario and Quebec. I think it's hard to have discussions about BIPOC communities, their resilience, and how to move forward without acknowledging that colonization is not only a historical fact, it's certainly not metaphorical or abstract, it's also the ongoing lived reality of the nation on whose unceded territory we live and work. So we have to commit to supporting Algonquin struggles, Algonquin nationhood, and Algonquin presence in real and substantial ways. And let's go meet our panelists.
So, Kwe Mindaloisi Saber, Aktalewe Puganchik. Hi everyone, my name is Saber Pictou Lee, and I'm a Mi'kmaq woman from Eel River Bar First Nation in northern New Brunswick. I'm currently living here in Halifax, Nova Scotia, on unceded, unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory, or as we call it, Mi'kmaqi. I'm actually the CEO and co-founder of Archipel, and we're really happy to be a partner with Rubiks Counseling on this podcast initiative. It's super exciting to be here today. Similar to Rubiks, Archipel really came to be after identifying gaps in Indigenous research and EDI research, or equity, diversity, and inclusion research. And we were founded 3 years ago, actually, and we now lead a diverse team of researchers and social scientist experts that specializes in both Indigenous related research and EDI work. I'm honored to have been selected as one of the 5 representatives for International Women's Week by Invest Ottawa. And I think today's conversation around these intergenerational gifts and things to celebrate as BIPOC women, especially entrepreneurial BIPOC women, and our diverse experiences is a unique lens and narrative that we don't get to explore. So I'm here alongside some 3 super brilliant women here to celebrate International Women's Week and the gifts that we have and we're carrying through. So I'll hand it over to Samaya to do an introduction.
Love how you handed that over to me. I'm like, but it's good. It's good. So I'm Samia, and I, also another founder of Rubiks Counseling Services with Wala. I started doing a lot of work in the community when I first graduated from school, worked with refugees, a lot of trauma work that we did there. And from there, we've kind of started to see, and what that was along the journey with that we've met through work. Through that, we started to see a lot of the gaps that existed. And so we've created Rubiks because of that. We really were trying to shift how mental health services were being provided. We value advocacy, community work, and that's really a big bulk of what Rubiks is working on. I'm super excited to be here. I'm very honored to have, these conversations with you, beautiful ladies, and continue to hope to have more to come.
I'm Letisa. I am a researcher at Archipel and a sociologist. Um, I came to Archipel because I wanted to be able to use my education and my voice to do the EDI work that I really believe in. So I'm very grateful to be able to do that and to be able to join you from Mexico while I'm living my best life working for a women-led company. And yeah, it's fantastic. So I'm excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, this is so exciting. I'm looking forward to it. So we'll keep it pretty informal. I'll ask a question and we'll just see where the conversation takes us. So first, if you can tell us a little bit about who the women are that empowered you and had a positive impact on your life.
When you said that the only woman that always comes to my mind is my mom. So just a little bit of a background on me, like we've traveled around a lot. So it was always just our family, my brother, myself, my mom, and my dad. And my dad was working a lot of the time. So my mom was really kind of like holding the spaces for us a lot of the times. And she, has had a very challenging life. But the way that she held herself in those situations is something that I've observed growing up. And so I really look up to her and admire her whenever I'm going through tough situations or when I'm making a decision. I always go back to my mom and be like, how would she have done it? Or what would she have, um, said to me in those moments of difficulties and challenges, right? So yeah, I would say she's the one that always is constant, that always shows up whenever someone asks me that, is like, who's that person? Like, who's, a model in your life? I'm like, mom shows up. But yeah, that's personally for me.
I feel like that question could just be like the mom question. I think.
Yeah.
I don't. I don't know who would
The
ask.
mom question.
I know, and I have to acknowledge that we're so. I think everyone here today, don't want to make an assumption, is so fortunate to have had that relationship with their mom and been such a fundamental inspiration and guide in our lives. And I know my mom's still my everything. She only has guided me throughout my entire life and sacrificed everything for me, but she also continues to challenge me in ways to grow that I wouldn't be able to do anywhere else. And you can't grow in a lot of ways with people in the same ways you can grow with your family, right? And I think it's just my own personal marker of being like, okay, like I've done some great stuff. I've been working on myself. I've been in therapy. My professional life is really good. And I'm gonna go home and spend some time with my mom. And then I'm like, immediately, I have a lot more work to do. But in the lens of really growing up, I feel like in my introduction, I shared more about Archipel and less about me, which sometimes gets lost in the nuance. But a little bit about myself. I had a pretty diverse upbringing, and I really came here as an Indigenous woman through an intersection of both athletics and academics. And academics was very much a later um, stream of my life when I was young. I always like to tell this because when I was a kid, I was a terrible kid. Like I was so bad, and I was expelled or asked to leave from like 5 different high schools. And I just was always a real troublemaker. And I really saw things. I think in part it was because I was a hypercritical thinker, and I've always been a hypercritical thinker, and I want to like poke and prod at things that don't make sense. And I don't like to be presumptuous, and I don't like to assume. And these are really great characteristics and skills and attributes when you grow up and want to be an entrepreneur or you want to do things in different fields. But when you're kids, they're not things that are really nurtured, and no one really teaches you how to understand yourself. And that's been something I've been really reflecting on the last couple of weeks. Is there's this huge gap where I learned all these skills to be successful in terms of the way society lays it out, but I haven't really learned how to get to know myself in an intimate way. And I haven't really learned to really be able to know what I want. And I think the only person in my life that has been helpful in that way is my mom. My mom has always been the one saying, okay, well, like, let's think about this. Like, you need to take a step back and prioritize your well-being and prioritize your mental health and prioritize what you want. And I don't think there's that narrative at all in our society quite yet. Unless it's coming from like within the women-led community, because it's still very like, okay, like I'm gonna finish school and I'm gonna get a really good job, but then I have to balance it with all of these really big stressors like taking care of a home and a partner and a family and balancing gender roles where we're not quite there yet. And I really like to reflect back and look at my mom and what she's led. And she is a 60 scoop survivor. She is a survivor of, forced Catholicism, or an Indian day school as it's known as. And she was really stripped away from her community and her culture, and fought really hard to be this radical, independent, beautiful spirit that she is today. And I feel so blessed, and it's a very cliche term to say, but I feel very blessed to have been raised by a woman who consistently and fundamentally thought outside the box. Her survival relied on thinking outside of the box, especially in the Canadian context and what that looked like being an Indigenous woman. My mother was born in, I believe, 1954. So being an Indigenous woman who grew up when Indigenous women didn't have quite yet the right to vote, or you really undervalued in our society. And for her to have survived that and then brought me into the world and gifted me all of that knowledge to be able to think outside the box, I feel so privileged. And that's something, as an Indigenous woman who's experienced pretty serious adverse racism growing up in a small town in Ontario, actually rural Ontario, there the racism was really extreme, and I've been reflecting on that a lot. I know I'm taking a lot of time. It's kind of, I'm talking like up and down here, but I've been reflecting a lot about how severe the bullying I faced was growing up. And I remember my little brother and I, who he's 2 years younger than me, and I remember like every day sitting on the school bus and hiding when kids, threw food at us, and racial slurs, and were beat up, and just day in and day out. And my mom handled it with such grace and such beauty to still take us aside and go, you guys are beautiful creatures with unique things that you have to continue to embrace, and allowed us to be super creative growing up. And you can see from my background, and for those who would just be listening audio, I have a lot of artwork in my background, and I have a background originally in art history. And I have an older brother who I remember growing up, he went through a phase where he wanted to like pretend he was a bird, and my mom like let him live in like the backyard for like a week or something, and he only ate bird food. And my mom was just always so supportive, and really just creative thought processes and our analytical thought processes, and really allowed us to flourish into these people. And so I sit here and say, wow, I feel so privileged.
And sorry to cut you off, Saber, but what really stands out to me is you started the story saying you were a really bad kid. and the child therapist in me was like, no. but really what it sounds like it was, and I think this is very common experience for BIPOC community growing up, is you just weren't allowed to be you. You were very creative, very curious, challenged the status quo, and that's not okay in the societies or the systems that we live in. And I think that's why this conversation about the women holding space, because Samia used that term as well when she described her mom, is so important, because without it, it's really hard to navigate that reality.
Absolutely. I'm so happy you pulled on that. That's like such a good point, because I'm always describing it as being a bad kid, and they may not be the most appropriate way to describe it, but I also think it's a way people relate to, right? And it's so integral to say, hey, that is the way we challenge the box. And And circling it back to my mom, it was this, I just shared a very long circular rant, but it was this idea of, wow, she held that space, like I
You did.
mentioned, and allowed me to be who I am. And it's a genuine privilege to be here today, and a genuine privilege to have been raised by my mom. So, that's
No, thank you for sharing all that. Letisa?
Yes, I've been reflecting as Saber was sharing, and I feel like we have a lot of similar experiences. Um, yeah, when I think about the women who have inspired me, of course, I think of my mom first. My mom had a very difficult childhood, and she had me very young, and she had no support. And she did a phenomenal job considering this. And she also had undiagnosed mental health conditions. When I was 14 years old, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And I watched her go through that very much on her own, independently. And so I have this very fraught relationship with the word independence and with the ideas of strength, right? But I'm definitely very rooted in my independence and my strength. Um, yeah, she definitely held space for me. I was a very angry child, um, and it just kind of simmered underneath for a very long time because I was very respectful. I performed all of my duties as I was supposed to, but I was mad as hell. And then as I came into my womanhood, I had to renegotiate. Now I have the space to be angry and to express my anger. And I also have the responsibility of how I show up in the world. And I was able to learn a lot from my mom, um, in this new phase of life about what do you do when you're mad, justifiably. How do you interact with those people and situations that enrage you? And I tapped into the rich culture of resistance of the Black women in my family, and what it meant to be angry and purposeful, and also hold space for joy and fun and the richness of my experience and what I want to have. So I walk that delicate balance in the footsteps of my mother, of being able to tap into that rage and also that joy and the infinite boundless love that is all of these things are me, all of these things are us, all of these things are women, and what we have to experience, and the choices that we make. It's all swirling, all of this emotion swirling, 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 and it's our power. Yeah, it's our power.
I love that. As soon as you said anger and purposefulness, that purposeful piece, it took me to like almost like flashbacks of different situations, different workplaces, different things that happened as a BIPOC woman, where I was angry and furious, but it fueled a sense of purpose, and it really was power because that could coexist with the joy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such a, as you were describing it, I'm like, yeah, I can pinpoint situations in my life where that was the case.
Yes. Yeah, my family has that I'm sure we can all relate, like fighting for freedom, fighting for independence. And that struggle can be enraging. It's like, why won't I just want the space to be myself, to look after myself, to look after my loved ones, And so, yeah, rage is very purposeful in my life. It doesn't really go anywhere. Just like the love and just like all of the other emotions, they're always there. We're all things all the time.
Something that really resonated with me with what Sabre you said and what you're touching on as well, Letisa, is this idea of the thinking outside of the box and being placed in these positions where the systems that were placed in, or our mothers were placed in, that, we couldn't really go by what other people were doing, right? Because they were women of color, they were going through some systems that were very dominant. Male, in my case, for my mom, was very male dominant, right? So this idea of being very creative, the power behind, thinking outside the box and being creative. When you guys were touching on, well, Sabra, you've mentioned is thinking outside the box, but Leticia, you're talking about that in some ways as well. It's like, yeah, this is the strength and the tool that I carry on from my mom when I'm in situations that are difficult, that I know that I may not be able to get away with it being someone of, color. I'm like, okay, how can I think about it differently? That, and I think what you can probably relate to some of the stuff in the workspaces that we've worked on. I'm like, this is not going to fly for us. What's a different way that we can kind of still make the move, but that will benefit us and support us?
And you know what, Samia, as you say that, Leticia, you talked about space and not being given space or needing to take up space. I know that a lot of the vision or missions behind Archipel and Rubiks have to do with that, providing the spaces, taking up space. And I'm wondering, throughout, whether it's like childhood, now, what did that look like for you guys? Were the spaces available? Did these women help create them? Did you have to create them yourselves? Like, this idea of taking up space, I'm interested in.
Yeah. I'm gonna speak to it. I was shy. I was very shy, but I had so much energy and so much creative juice. But I was always scared to tap in and to show up fully as myself. And I found that my sister friends, we created those spaces for ourselves. And now I'm in a stage where I don't care and I just take up as much space as I need. And I call it like like there's definitely a negative connotation sometimes to the aunties, but I feel I'm reclaiming it in a positive way. I'm definitely that auntie that is like, no, I need this amount of space and these are my requirements for how you deal with me. And I love that for me.
Yes.
I can jump in. I think it's so multi-layered. When I was really young, probably like 17, I could see that I was watching women in my life change and shift to being, really upset. I was seeing the shift happen from, women in their teenage years and in their 20s who were really vibrant, and I was watching life take that away from them. And this wasn't, a BIPOC specific thing, but for women as a whole, I was watching, heartbreak happen time and again, and loss happen, and space not being saved for them happen. And these things were eroding at their spirit. And I could see this happening when I was like 16. And I remember being young and saying, whoa, like I made a promise to myself. And at that time, it was really naive, and it was one dimensional, because I promised myself not to become jaded. Like that's what I was seeing it as I was feeling that people were, have been hurt repeatedly and were becoming jaded and had lost that spark. And that's what I was seeing it as. And I was like, there's no way I'm going to allow myself to do that. And then as I've aged, you see all these layers that impact someone's spirit. And I can very much recognize how difficult that is. And then I also have very much recognized Leticia's mindset of like, I don't give a fuck. And it's at the same time, it's like, I care so much. These things will not impact me. Like that is, so I can say, I sit here and say, I don't give a fuck, but actually, I've embodied the total opposite. I've embodied so much love for life and so much love for taking up space and for challenging the norm and for just, refusing to cede even a little inch of who I am, that it's allowed me to continue this way.
And as you say that, Sabra, I wonder if it's because of what you had witnessed. Because when I reflect on what you're saying, that love, that passion, it came from watching women around me do it. Even if they struggled, even if they had those moments where they were kind of just like, okay, that's it, I can't do this anymore. Even if there was that, the coexisting of all the emotions.
Yeah.
but seeing it around me is what made it just a part of how I functioned.
Absolutely. And I think it's you can't really convey this to the other genders. Like it's so hard to convey the way women rally and have community to support each other in this. And that's what I'm doing, I think. That's what I'm creating. And when we talk about how we're holding space now, all of those little things have led to me to just caring so much, where every inch of my being just loves everything, whether it's a single smile or a single this and that. And I'm talking really professionally too, that the work I do lets me hold that space where I just say, I have fought hard for this space, and now it's just my turn to allow other women to come up and hopefully, really hopefully, not have to endure some of the things we have had to get there. Just like
Yes.
I have not endured what my mother, or none of us have endured what our mothers have had to get through to allow us to be in this space. And now it's our turn to give that same opportunity and same space. And I'll share really an example of mine is that at Archipel we had this project, and it was a really fancy project where we did a historical research report, and then we had to present it to a roundtable of leaders in Canada and international leaders and ministers and royalty. And it was there was a lot of elevation in this round table, and a series of us had to present. And I turned inward and said, okay, well, one of our researchers who was 22 at the time or 21 at the time who worked on it, I said, well, you're going to come, like, if you're comfortable, you're going to come present to these people. And she was able to join us in this circle and share her experiences and share her reflections working on this report to world leaders, to leaders in the space. And it was this moment where I was like crying, and I was like, okay, like, get it together, you're moderating this. And I'm crying just thinking, wow, like we've now created a space where Indigenous women, BIPOC women who are young and have a voice can now come into these spaces and speak. And that's really all I want to be doing. And I don't want to be going into these spaces and speaking. And as much as I love it, I want to be uplifting the voices that need to be heard and holding that space. And that's what I'm doing in work and in my personal life, and all these little nuances, and hearing everyone here continues to inspire me to do that.
And I love how you said we didn't experience what our mothers or the other women in our lives experienced, and we got here, and then now it's providing that for others. And that kind of takes me to the second half of the conversation of talking a little bit more about how we got where we're at today. As women who are part of women-led organizations, who are constantly doing the work, how do we continue to do the work and pass on these gifts?
When you guys were talking about holding a space, I'm like, yeah, like it's important to have these spaces and continue to, like, kind of us having this conversation. But one thing that was clicking for me as you guys were talking is that I have a little bit more of a harder time allowing myself to hold that space for myself than allowing the spaces for others. Does that make sense? Like holding spaces for others, I can advocate, I can say, no, we need to have these spaces where women have a conversation. I know this through experience. My mom's gone through this as experience, but I have a hard time allowing myself first to hold that space. Right. And I think that a big part of it is working, for me at least personally, is working through that you are allowed to have the space. And just hearing you ladies talk about it kind of validates that experience for me. And it's this constant work of it's kind of like the being compassionate towards other, but having a difficult time being compassionate towards yourself. Sometimes I doubt that. Sometimes I'm in spaces where I'm like, maybe I'm taking up too much space, and what's enough space to take, and should I be saying this or should I not be saying that? But yet for others, I have no problem like rallying and saying we need to do this. But I think a lot of that work also has to do individually, where I give myself that period where I believe that to be true, because I feel like, similarly to my mom, she's constantly saying me, like, I provided this for you, but when you see her talking to others now, maybe a little bit before was different circumstances. My kids come first. I need to make sure that they're okay, right? Now she's advocating for herself. It's very different. And I'm like, but mom, you provided that space for me to be able to do that. And she's like, oh yeah, did I? And there's that doubt of like, can I hold that space for myself?
And you know what's interesting about that, Samia? Leticia mentioned earlier the concept of strong and independent and how she has an interesting relationship with it. And I think for BIPOC women, there's a constant narrative of sacrifice, strong, independent. We just get things done. And when you're thinking that way, it's easier to rally behind a cause or hold space for other people. But where's the me and my humanness and me being able to sometimes not be strong, and sometimes I do need my circle and I don't want to be independent, and those narratives, right?
I was just gonna say, I think women we tend to have really shitty internal narratives, like really shitty narratives where I am so hard on myself. I am so hard on myself. And I have to have people in my life, or I currently need to have people in my life who tell me, don't be so hard on yourself. Like I haven't learned to embody that narrative yet. And that's a barrier for me, but I think that's a really common barrier.
Yeah, when you were speaking, I was thinking about my mother and having to remind her what she taught me. And it's like, now that you are no longer responsible for me in these ways, all of this energy that you put forth to holding space for me is now for you. And now I can hold space for you in the ways that you held space for me. I've had numerous discussions with my mom, and I've had to remind her, like, no, you told me that we don't do these things, or you told me that we don't allow people to speak to us in this way. So I'm just going to remind you that this was the lesson that you taught. So yeah, it's definitely very cyclical, and yeah, it's a back and forth relationship.
Yeah. I love how you just put that, Leticia. It just nailed it for me. Like my throat is in knots now. I'm like, yes, it's the reminding piece, right? But it is very much so multi-layered that it's complex. A lot of the
I had hardships, but there's so many that I got to avoid simply by the fact that my mom was there holding space for me, buffering, um, keeping the wolves from my doorstep. She did all of that work so I didn't have to do it. There's so many things I didn't have to experience, and I'm so blessed for that. I had my own um, obstacles, and I'm really so grateful for all of those obstacles, because where I'm at now and the strength with which I walk through life and the grace with which I wield all of my power comes from my mother and how she did it first. And so it's easy. It's like when you're walking in the snow and the snow is really high and someone goes before you and you can just sink into your feet just sink into their footprints. It's like that. Yeah.
You know what's interesting about that image, Leticia, is I feel like as we're walking in those footprints, sometimes we don't realize we are.
Mm.
It's a lot of times it's in retrospect, especially when we talk about relationships with family and moms and how it can be complex growing up. That those footprints, sometimes we don't realize they were already there for us.
Yeah. And that speaks to like sometimes the grace of our mothers to not be like, well, doesn't have to, she doesn't feel that need. Her ego has no need to remind me. Right. And so these subtle dawnings that happen are very profound because I'm stepping into it on my own. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I know we've been talking a lot about mothers, but I'm wondering if you guys had anything to add about community, whether that's extended family for you, whether it's the neighborhood, and the role that the women played in that for you.
I'm gonna be honest. So growing up, like I said, it was just us, and we always moved around in different spaces. So I didn't really have, and you've spoken to you about this before. Like community wasn't there for me because well, there for me in a sense of like I didn't really have much of a community because we were moving so much around. So it was literally just my mom, my brother, and my father, right? So my mom kind of led that way. And then coming to Ottawa when I was 16, 17, I believe, was the first time that I was kind of on my own of trying to figure that piece out and what does community look like and what community do I want to be a part of, and having conversations with other women about this. At first, it was honestly just my mom, right? So I did a little bit of that work of the community building, understanding what that looks like, of those intergenerational stories and all those pieces from other women once I stepped into that space. Prior to that, it was a lot of my mom holding that for me. So it was new and different and exciting, but also kind of, weird to think about your life not having that so much around you. It was very normalized for me, at least, right? This was the norm. This is what it is. So yeah, I've been reflecting on that ever since. So for me, to answer your question, it grew as time passed, but more into my adulthood years, very adulthood years, like 25 and above, kind of.
That counts. Community, I think, like changes and reshapes and then is shaped again, just over and over throughout your entire life. For me, when I was young, community was very different for me. My mom um, didn't have a family when I was growing up, and the community of women became a makeshift group of BIPOC women, of BIPOC moms, raising BIPOC children in a rural, super white town in Ontario. So the few of us together became each other's community. And that was, again, something you learn when you reflect on your life at some point later on. It wasn't something when I was 8 years old. It was like, wow, like, I have a tia, or I have an auntie who's from Mexico City, and I have like all this diverse BIPOC women who are picking me up from school or picking me up when I'm being suspended, or all these things, and feeding me and taking care of me. And I was like, oh, as an adult now, I'm like, that who is who invested the energy into me as I lived. It was a huge investment on their part, and I can't, I'm now in a stage of my life where I'm like, oh, I don't know how moms do this. The whole entire life, ever since I was very little, I craved community so intensely. I craved support like nothing I've ever craved in my life. And it became a real element that I use to further my purposes, that I use to further the work that I do today. And when I was in my teenage years, and I think my experience as an Indigenous woman was unique in the fact that my mom was told by nuns at a Catholic school that her family were dead. They either died or they left her, and they didn't want anything to do with her. And our culture was problematic, and all of these things that we weren't allowed to be really Indigenous. We weren't allowed to be Mi'kmaq. And when I came up, I just, it didn't sit right with me. When I was a teenager, it was again one of these things that status quo and what I was told by authority wasn't acceptable for me. I challenged it continuously throughout my whole life, and I still do. And I took that to my mom and I said, listen, mom, I know you keep telling me that all our Mi'kmaq family's dead and like this is it. It's just you and I and my brothers like roaming the plains. And I'm like, but that I'm gonna call bullshit. Like this doesn't make any sense to me at all. And I knew I was from my Mi'kmaq community of the River Bar First Nation. And so when I was 18, 19, I said, fuck it. And I got in a vehicle and I drove to New Brunswick with my partner, my boyfriend at the time, who was also like, you're a little crazy. And I said, no, like, I don't believe it. It doesn't make any sense to me. Like, and I'm craving community and I'm craving, that connection. And it was a huge gap in my life and in my heart and my soul.
Yeah.
And I committed to driving across the country after having like written letters and got no response, and calling my community and not hearing back. And I came back, and within a year or two of coming home, it ended up that I had a really large family. My mom comes from a family of like 14 siblings and countless cousins and second cousins, and were, very strong into our culture and into our traditional practices and things that resonated with me for a long, long time. And I didn't have the avenues to explore. And so, again, I'm not advocating anyone else do this, but I came back to Ontario and grabbed my mom, basically kicking and screaming, because at this point she became so, as Leticia said, hyper independent. She did not want to experience community like that, and she did not want to experience family, because she was now, a 50-year-old woman who had fought tooth and nail to survive and be in that position. So anything but that is terrifying. And I came home and I took her back. I took her back to New Brunswick, and I ended up introducing her to her family. And now we fast forward a few years, and she actually lives at home with our family, with our immediate family, with our extended family in our community. And we all, are very deeply rooted in our culture and our cultural practices. And it brings me to my knees to think that my nieces and nephews, my baby cousins, are now being raised in community with my mom, and they'll never know that she wasn't there. They'll never know that she wasn't there for the first 50 years, that she was taken through means of the federal government from her community and forcibly relocated into Ontario as a baby. That narrative is no longer in existence. What's there is a woman who has lived and survived and is now thriving and can pass on all of her teachings. My mom is, now a widow, and so her whole community is comprised of women supporting each other and building each other up. And it has been what drives me.
Yeah.
Is my relationship with community.
And I think that's beautiful. It reminds me of Leticia's point about it being cyclical, where that child that was getting always in trouble because she didn't like the status quo and her personality was just so different. You came back and brought your mom back to family and gave her that push because you were craving the community so much. And you didn't take no for an answer. And I think that cyclical piece of, it's not just the women that empowered us throughout, but it's the role we continue to play in each other's lives and how vital it is. Like the community is not, we can't really define it, but that piece of knowing that we have each other's backs.
I'm in a space right now where I'm starting over. And it was not my plan to do so. And I'm someone who's very, like, when my plans are changed, it's very begrudging. So I'm learning to release and surrender to the process. And also I'm building community now at this stage of my life with a brand new set of people and a brand new, to me, country. And it is very liberating, and I'm attracting in exactly those women who I have always wanted to build community with. So I'm just very much in my gratitude about that. Yeah, I it's amazing. You can go anywhere in the world and have this kind of experience.
Yeah.
If you're open to it, because we're everywhere.
Wow.
There are women everywhere doing this kind of work, building community, supporting each other, holding space for each other, protecting each other, loving on each other, healing with each other. And that's what I'm partaking in. I'm just doing it here right now.
Yeah.
And it's such a beautiful thing. It doesn't take us, I've had conversations with women that have lasted maybe a half an hour, and we're embracing at the end and saying, I love you. Right? And that's so beautiful. That vulnerability, that openness, that was something that I didn't allow myself to experience, or I wasn't able to tap into from a place of hurting and resistance, like being able to open up to any woman and say, I love you, and genuinely feel it and mean it. It's a beautiful thing. And that's what community building with women is for me.
Yeah. I love how you put it. No matter where you are in the world.
That really hit a stroke there for me, Leticia, because for me it was more fear-based, right? Because it was a lot of the times me and my mom has not intentionally instilled some fears around that because of the life that she's gone through, right? So I myself kind of carried that with me moving forward. And but it's that openness that you talk about that is really important if you're open to that, to build that community. But I've always been reserved at the beginning as well, right? It's that fear of like, if I do, what happens? And is similar things going to happen to what happened to my mom? And, you know, her fear became my fear to a certain degree. And being able to distinguish that was really important for me, to be open, to be vulnerable, to have these conversations, to embrace, as you said. And you know, it doesn't you can have those half an hour conversations with people and connect so much with them and be vulnerable with them. And I've had those experiences now, haven't had them before because it took me so long to get here, right?
Yeah.
And I think that says a lot about just how vital community is for BIPOC community, for BIPOC people. I mean, for me, it's a little different where I don't know what reality looks like without community. So when I walk into a room, Saber, I really related to you craving it. When I walk into a room, I'm looking for it. And if I can't see it, I'm trying to think of how to create it. Because I don't know how to just, it was never just us. It was never just the individual. It was never just my family. It was always in the midst of something. And I think that has been a huge part of how I've been able to navigate my life as a BIPOC woman, whether it's dealing with the anger or dealing with the injustices or whatever challenges there are, of like, okay, it's okay. I can do this, but not alone. And that piece is so important because often as BIPOC, there's this idea of people don't get it, don't get my reality, don't understand it, sometimes don't care. So having those people around makes a huge difference in how we actually basically create the spaces that we were talking about earlier, and how we function and how we are able to continue the work for those that are coming after us. I'm gonna give you guys, just if anyone has any last words before we wrap up. I mean, we could probably go on forever on this topic. We just take us from like one aspect to the next. But we're kind of coming to the end. So any last words or reflections from anyone?
You know how they say that you can do therapy in different spaces and it doesn't have to be like one-on-one individual work with a therapist? I feel like this was very therapeutic for me where certain things kind of clicked. I'm like, yes, I need to reflect more on that. I need to reflect more on this. And thank you for that. I really appreciate it. And I'm hoping to have more conversations with you ladies and of course with many more, that whoever wants to join us.
Yes, I just want to echo that. I've loved every second of this, and really hits hard at the end there where we just touched on, you can do this, but we usually can't do it alone. And it just applies to every area of my life where you feel lost, even if it's for a second or a week or an hour. And just to know that we do have these communities, whether they're makeshift or over our whole lives, or they're an intergenerational community, or just a momentary community. Like, there's ways for us to connect and wade through whatever we're dealing with. And yeah, this has been a wonderful opportunity. I really look forward to more healing and more sharing in the future.
But thank you for joining us today. I really enjoyed it. Thank you guys for sharing your personal experiences, the vulnerability. I can really almost like feel the emotion in this virtual room. And I look forward to ongoing conversations.